Hello, everyone, and welcome to Electric Autonomy and our Fireside Chat today on lessons learned from Fleet Electrification. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion, which is brought to you in partnership with Element Fleet Management, a leading global fleet management company. We're grateful to Element for their support for this discussion series. Well, it's an enormous task to transition fleets to electric vehicles, as anyone who's been through the process will tell you. The process involves many stakeholders, both inside and outside the fleet organisation, and a lot of new technologies that need to be understood and deployed. At Electric Autonomy, we're always looking to share best practices and examples of leadership from people who have lived and breathed the experience of making the EV transition. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Zingha Lucien, Director of Strategic Consulting at Element Fleet Management, who has tremendous experience in the transition to electric fleets. Hi, Zingha. How are you doing today?
Hi, Nino. Thank you. I'm good. Thank you for including Element in the conversation.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. I know you've got tons of experience doing this, and I'm really excited to dive into the discussion with you. Whereabouts are you speaking to us from today?
I am located in Sparks, Maryland, one of our main offices in the United States.
Awesome, great. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, Ontario. So we've got a good little connection going across the border here.
Sure.
Well, you won't be surprised to know we've already had many questions submitted by the audience during the registration process. And just to everyone in the audience, we'd still love to hear your questions in the live Q&A function. So please use the Q&A box in the bottom right of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. If you'd like to make a comment and you're not asking a question, please use the chat box, and you can engage with other attendees in the audience. But if you have a question, please put them in the Q&A section. So to kick things off, Zingha, it would be great if you could share a little bit about Element Fleet Management and a little bit about your experience with the electrification of vehicle fleets.
Yeah, for sure. Element is the #1 fleet management company globally. We share partnership with Arval globally in Europe and in Latin America. Element has offices and visibility in North America, so US and Canada, and Mexico as well. We are also located in Australia, New Zealand. And of course, we're focused on, of course, not just electrification, but fleet management as a whole, from the acquisition of the vehicle all the way to remarketing and all of the services aligned with fleet, maintenance, fuel, toll management, etc. So we have a very comprehensive offering around fleet, from leasing all the way to remarketing. But our focus is global and very comprehensively focused on solving the general problems and challenges around fleet.
That's awesome. So with that experience, and obviously you've got, I mean, every organization now is obviously considering electrification as a pathway and an imperative for them to do. Yeah. What are you finding are the primary objectives for the companies who do approach you and say, hey, we want to kind of make this step? What are the objectives that you're finding people are saying their reasons for doing this?
Really good question. And as you can imagine, there are many motivations around electrifying one's fleet. I think on a micro scale, a lot of organizations care about their reputations. So certainly there's been heightened awareness around environmental and social responsibility. So there's definitely a response to that. And by them moving towards electrification, it certainly improves on their environmental credentials, as well as their reputation. So that's one of the very first things, of course, with a heightened focus on the environment. They're also motivated by total cost of operations, whether that's for the future or even today with the inclusion of incentives, but definitely around fuel, the cost of fuel compared to ICE vehicles as well. So that's definitely one of the objectives when they pursue electric vehicles. The third, I would say, would be employee, on a micro scale at least, employee retention. So that's definitely one of the things that a lot of fleets consider, particularly for the executive fleets or for any of the executive employees or any of the high performing employees as well. On a macro scale, however, they are motivated by either laws and regulations, and of course, energy security is heightened focus for any one government, whether it's federal or state or provincial. They're also motivated by certain incentives that may be given by those governmental organizations as well. As you can imagine, sustainability is definitely moving in an upward trend, or at least the focus on sustainability is moving in an upward trend. So there's the response to that from a lot of corporations. And so it's multiple factors that they take into considerations, whether it's all of those factors or some of them, to help them move towards electrification of their fleet.
That's awesome. So with that experience, and obviously you've got, I mean, every organization now is obviously considering electrification as a pathway and an imperative for them to do. Yeah. What are you finding are the primary objectives for the companies who do approach you and say, hey, we want to kind of make this step? What are the objectives that you're finding people are saying their reasons for doing this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you can imagine, there are many motivations around electrifying one's fleet. I think on a micro scale, a lot of organizations care about their reputations. So certainly there's been heightened awareness around environmental and social responsibility. So there's definitely a response to that. And by them moving towards electrification, it certainly improves on their environmental credentials, as well as their reputation. So that's one of the very first things, of course, with a heightened focus on the environment. They're also motivated by total cost of operations, whether that's for the future or even today with the inclusion of incentives, but definitely around fuel, the cost of fuel compared to ICE vehicles as well. So that's definitely one of the objectives when they pursue electric vehicles. The third, I would say, would be employee, on a micro scale at least, employee retention. So that's definitely one of the things that a lot of fleets consider, particularly for the executive fleets or for any of the executive employees or any of the high performing employees as well. On a macro scale, however, they are motivated by either laws and regulations, and of course, energy security is heightened focus for any one government, whether it's federal or state or provincial. They're also motivated by certain incentives that may be given by those governmental organizations as well. As you can imagine, sustainability is definitely moving in an upward trend, or at least the focus on sustainability is moving in an upward trend. So there's the response to that from a lot of corporations. And so it's multiple factors that they take into considerations, whether it's all of those factors or some of them, to help them move towards electrification of their fleet.
That's great. Well, there's some very compelling reasons there for people to go. I mean, if I can maybe just take the counter view, is when, I mean, you've set out a series of compelling points. What are the reasons that you find that people may look into it but not kind of pull the trigger, that might step away from it or delay the process? And I know we're going to cover a lot of the details throughout this discussion, but I wonder if we can kind of get to that one off the bat.
There are a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, a lot of concerns that come from just the average person or the average fleet. I think the very first would be range, right? So we know that there are challenges around infrastructure. I'd say that, of course, it is improving. We've seen significant improvements in the past few years, but a lot of organizations are waiting for the infrastructural network to improve, certainly to match the utilization of their vehicles. So that's the very first thing. Range, of course, dependent on the infrastructure and how those two interact, certainly it comes into play as well. I think the third thing is the initial cost of the vehicle. So there's, of course, an increased price for electric vehicles. They take that into consideration compared to a lot of budgeting constraints that they may have. These things, I mean, there's a lot still to learn. I think we're still learning. This industry is learning by doing. And as we get more information, which a lot of organizations are waiting on, as we continue to use those vehicles, definitely that will help us or help them get a little bit more confidence in investing in electric vehicles.
I think that's a really interesting phrase, learning by doing. And it's always easy to kind of wait for other people to be at that front edge and to figure things out. But I mean, it just inherent in that statement, it seems that if you're not experimenting or you're not actually looking at deployment for yourself, then you're going to be at a knowledge disadvantage if you don't actually at least start down this process one way, in one manner or another.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think we all have our parts to play in electrification, right? So I hear a lot of questions about the data. So provide me the data that shows me or gives me a compelling reason to move towards electrification. And I think that is definitely a good question or good ask, but we all have our parts to play in it. So without fleets participating in the movement towards electrification, there's less data, right? Without them using those assets, similarly to how they would use some of their ICE vehicles, we wouldn't have that data to make those recommendations for electrification. So there's still a lot to learn. And almost every single aspect of electrification is still trying to understand the major questions that they're facing, right? So learning by doing is definitely something I think that almost every aspect of this industry is employing, just making sure that they could modify to what's found as they get a lot more data, for sure.
So you mentioned TCO, and let's get into the financial aspect a little bit, because obviously this is a major driver for businesses, of course.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe it's a good chance to bring in a comment from the audience that we had through the registration process. Is you obviously mentioned the environmental kind of aspects of it as well, and I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which you would consider credits from the clean fuel regulations, or place a value on really kind of emissions reductions into that calculation. I wonder how you kind of work that equation in.
To be fair, when we look at TCO, we don't look at credits as much as we do all of the other costs associated with electrification. Certainly, emissions is important. That is definitely something that we do consider. So, of course, you would want to know the relative difference in emissions for ICE vehicles versus electric vehicles. But with regards to the credit specifically, although some customers do ask about credits, we don't take that into consideration for TCO. There are a lot of factors, and I'm happy to take you through that, what we do consider for TCO, if that's the specific question. Sorry.
Yeah. You queued us up nicely for another audience member question that came through registrations was, please discuss the BEV total cost of operations compared to diesel and H2. I mean, obviously, I know H2 is kind of really very much at a nascent stage. So perhaps you might just want to focus on diesel and gasoline. Obviously, for light duty would be much more common. Especially if you're able to bring in the cost of charging infrastructure, electrical upgrades, driver training, and so on.
Yeah, and I'm happy to briefly touch on H2 because there's not a lot of information there. Certainly, we don't get asked as much questions around H2 when it comes to TCO. So there's not a lot that I can provide there. Separate from some customers are definitely considering H2, particularly in California. I find for organizations that do operate there are questions around H2. However, if we look at conventional vehicles versus electric vehicles, there, I think on a very basic level, right? Very basic level, what we look at is the initial cost of the vehicle versus the operating cost. That's on a very basic level. So the initial cost of the vehicle certainly favors ICE vehicles, right? Electric vehicles generally are more expensive than ICE vehicles, and it favors EVs on the operating side. But we know that this is a little bit more complicated than just these two costs. There are some hidden costs. There's some other things that we have to consider. So you asked specifically around the infrastructure, right? So if it's a take-home fleet, I think there are certain things that you have to ask, right? So firstly, is there driver readiness? That's important, but also is there installation feasibility? Because we do know that some drivers live in apartments. So how do you solve for that? If you're thinking of fueling the vehicles or charging the vehicles at home, you'd have to take that into consideration. And if you are charging the vehicles at home, you'd certainly want to consider the charging infrastructure that you'd have to install in those homes as well. So that's definitely a cost. And we know that in the short term, there's some other costs like title and registration that you'd have to consider, insurance costs, and certainly downtime is definitely something that we'd have to consider, particularly with fueling those vehicles, how long it would take to fuel these vehicles. So that's important. On the operational side, definitely there are benefits with regards to fuel cost. We do know that electric vehicles are a lot more efficient than ICE vehicles, and so there are benefits there. There is a little bit unknowns with regards to unscheduled maintenance. I think it's still early days for a lot of electric vehicles. So just I think over time, as we continue to use those vehicles, we'll have a better understanding of what the demands are when it comes to repairs. But preventive maintenance is a little bit more clear. Of course, there are fewer parts in those vehicles. And therefore, we would expect there to be fewer maintenance needs when it comes to preventive care. Tires may be a little bit higher. What we have seen, at least from the data that has been provided to us through the utilization of electric vehicles within our portfolios, what we have seen is that for the maintenance costs, it's approximately 50% of what we would see for ICE vehicles. The one thing I do caution to a lot of customers when it comes to TCO, however, is that the TCO cost of today is not necessarily that of tomorrow. We know that increasingly electric vehicle costs are decreasing. The infrastructure landscape is changing as well, right? There are investments with regards to grid infrastructure as well, just making sure that they're incorporating renewable energy. So that's certainly going to change the cost of fuel in the future. And so there are a lot of things that are changing that will eventually lean towards TCO cost for electric vehicles being a lot less than it is today. But I'd say that it's still early and there's a lot more to learn when it comes to TCO.
Yeah, it's great. And so the 50% cost savings on maintenance, I think. So really interesting number, and we'll take a deeper dive on some of the maintenance stuff a little bit into the conversation. But I wondered if you have an equal ballpark figure for fuel costs. Do you have a sense of how the fuel cost compares electric to combustion?
The thing about it, of course, if we look side by side for any one particular, so let's say we look at the Lightning versus the F-150, for example, depending on how the vehicle is driven, depending on where the vehicle is driven, because all of these factors, come into play. And sometimes it's hard to give a necessary reduction in cost, but we've seen from 50% to a little higher. It could be slightly lower depending on the weather demands or payload demands of those assets as well. There was one particular study that I was looking at from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that was speaking to not necessarily at one point in time, but over the life of the asset. What does that look like as far as savings goes for fuel in particular? Now, of course, most fleets don't keep their vehicles for 15 years. They're speaking to approximately 14,000 in savings when it comes to fuel, comparing ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. But I think it really and truly depends on how much those vehicles are driving, what type of assets they're incorporating in their fleet, where they're driving those vehicles as well. That will determine what the delta is and what the cost savings are with regards to fuel.
Right. And advantage of electricity is that it's typically regulated, and so there's not so much volatility as you get with gasoline prices.
Absolutely. And that, it's good that you mentioned that. Just going back to one of your earlier questions about the motivations or the objectives, certainly when we saw increasing geopolitical uncertainties in the market, that was one of the things that really pushed a lot of fleets to ask the questions around electrification. So that's definitely one of the reasons. And I'd say one of the benefits to moving to electric vehicles for sure.
Well, we have another question that was submitted by an audience member on registration, which is, can you point me to specific studies comparing TCO of diesel, battery electric and H2 trucks from class 1 through class 8? And I wonder if there's anything that you might be able to point that individual to.
There, of course, are a lot of studies out there. I can't give you the specific examples right at this minute. I know certainly our electrification team, our ARC team, very much aware of that, has, worked specifically with organizations for all classes of vehicles. I can't point you to particular studies. Here's what I will tell you. We do, of course, work with large to small fleets, with all various, classes of vehicles. There are particular use cases for electrification within your fleet that we can definitely share. Some success stories that we've had. When it comes to the statistics that this question is leading to, what I will say is that it's still pretty much early days. And when it comes to electric vehicles or any statistical measure for that matter, critical mass matters, right? So what we don't do at Element is rush to any one conclusion when it comes to any one asset or any one scenario. What we have done on our part is employed pilots within a lot of the programs that we have with our customers. What we've done is incorporated pilots and tried to understand the needs for their specific fleet applications. But we've also tried to modify what we recommend, right, what they utilize within their fleets to make sure that it's whatever recommendations that we put in place are specific to what their needs are. I don't think until we get to the point where we have critical mass that it would be that we would be able to make those assertions with regards to any one class of vehicle.
Brings us back to learning by doing.
Yeah, learning by doing for sure.
So yeah, on that point, which vehicles are you finding are the most suitable? Which vehicle types are you finding are the most suitable candidates for EV transition?
That's a good question, Nino. Well, of course, availability comes into play here, right? So I'd say with regards to availability, certainly cars and SUVs, car fleets, SUV fleets definitely would be the most appropriate. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that, right? So it's not just availability, it's also allocation. It's the way that they drive those vehicles. It's the fuel infrastructure around those vehicles as well. There's one thing though that we found with most of the fleets that we've worked with. One of the success factors, separate from anything that they can affect with regards to vehicle availability, etc., I'd say one of the success factors in forwarding electrification is the commitment by leadership and the commitment to seeing it through. So that's the overarching success factors for electrification. But of course, there's application to various industries, various vehicle types, but I think it first starts off with the availability of those assets.
So yeah, that commitment from leadership, that's an interesting point we'll dive into perhaps in a moment for the success. So obviously car fleets, SUVs, there's a significant now opportunity of vehicles, and then obviously pickups. You mentioned the F150, and just curious about how you're finding the F150 and the I mean, I think F150 is kind of like the primary candidate for pickup conversion now. But yeah, just wondering if you have any comments on that particular category.
I think there's been a lot of questions around it. There have been some investments. We do see some customers actually buying, the Lightning, for example. There is, I think, a greater need there than there's availability there, right? I know that we've had some OEMs pull back on their offerings. But what we are seeing on our end is a lot more questions, a lot more interest in electrification, whether it's on the pickup side or car fleets, etc. Certainly, there's been questions on the heavy duty side as well. But we have a significant portion of our portfolio who are invested in pickup trucks in that particular category. And I think with a greater offering, there will definitely be greater investment in that particular class of vehicles. So I think that it's somewhat of a waiting game, if I can say that. But of course, it's not just a matter of a waiting game. We, I think, had a conversation about the upfitting of those vehicles. A lot of our customers do upfit their pickup trucks. There are certain needs that we want to make sure that these vehicles are responding to those specific needs. And to my point, learning by doing, there's still a little bit of fear with regards to the range, with regards to payload. And certainly we want to employ pilots to understand what the need is there and how we respond to it. But there's certainly a lot of interest in that category for sure.
And indeed, yeah, it was a question that we had submitted by an audience member about evaluating the weight of upfitting and equipment in prep for EVs. Is there anything sort of fundamentally different in the approach of upfitting an EV other than just the consideration of the weight of that, those materials and the impact they'll have on range?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I can't tell you I can't speak to the particular process. What I can tell you is that one, it is top of mind for a lot of our customers, as it should be. We do know that electric vehicles are a little bit heavier than their ICE counterparts, right? So the added weight from upfitting certainly matters, right? So there has to be a proper strategy around the upfitting of vehicles, particularly with regards to electric vehicles, because we know that it has a significant impact on the efficiency of the vehicles, right? So in conversations with customers, they're looking a little bit more closely at what options they have available to them. No one wants added weight on those vehicles, certainly. So I think that's something that's likely to change a lot of the ways that parts are being manufactured, taking that into consideration, particularly since we're moving towards electrification. I think definitely that should be considered.
Thanks, Zingha. And another question on vehicles and vehicle operation is obviously something that's becoming quite topical as the seasons are marching on. Is what are some of the ways to make EVs more efficient in winter? Any tips that you can give out?
Yeah, there are a few things, certainly making sure. And so to take a step back, a lot of the things that you do employ, even for ICE vehicles, is what you would do for electric vehicles as well, right? So making sure that your tires are fully inflated, give the vehicle some time to warm up, definitely is important. Making sure I laugh a little bit because I was in a situation not too long ago, caught up in a storm, and one of the individuals that I interacted with was in an electric vehicle that, unfortunately shut down on him. But there are certain things that he did not employ, and we were having that conversation, right? So how do you map out your charging throughout the course of your trip, wherever you're going, just making sure that you are fully charged up is definitely important, particularly for winter months for electric vehicles, because we do know that there's a certain level of degradation. It's not as efficient in those cold months or cold regions. So that's something that they would definitely have to employ, have a good charging strategy, no matter where you go. Optimize routing as best as you can. But a lot of the things that you do employ for ICE vehicles is what I would recommend for electric vehicles as well. There's certain things that are certainly outside the control of the driver, right? But where you can impact it, certainly I would encourage that you do so.
Yeah, that point about obviously making sure the vehicles are fully charged and also preconditioned as well while it's still on, actually with the charging terminal, to make sure the vehicle's already warmed up in advance of the journey starting. Yeah, certainly a very topical point now. So one of the big decisions that fleet operators need to make is actually how to just get started on this transition. And you've touched on it a little bit in some of our previous questions, but specific questions that come up very, very commonly, and it touches on the issues of availability as well, is should you go to hybrid vehicles first or plug-in hybrid vehicles first before going to full battery electric? And so I wonder what your advice might be there.
We do get that question quite often, right? I think it really and truly depends. It's not a set answer. You don't necessarily have to follow a particular path of hybrid vehicles first or straight to electric vehicles. There's a lot of data out there, but I think firstly, fleets would have to start with their specific data. The question is, how does whatever sustainability roadmap you have in place, how does that represent your particular need? And so that's what needs to be assessed. My recommendation to most fleets is to fully assess that. The best thing is data, your specific data. And I found that a lot of fleets who are successful employ telematics. So they know where their vehicles are being driven. They know, of course, who, if you do, if you have that information, who those drivers are to assess for charging feasibility or driver readiness. But they understand the specific need with regards to their operations. So start with telematics information. After you've assessed that, of course, there are other needs like vehicle availability, how much you're using those vehicles, right? So we know that right now there are challenges around infrastructure. So where you're driving those vehicles and how much you're driving these vehicles will determine whether you need multiple solutions with regards to charging, right? So that's definitely something that you'd have to consider. But I think making those plans or assessing the feasibility or the viability of your fleet moving to electric vehicles does not negate the need for hybrid vehicles or even ICE vehicles for that matter. It could be a combination of the three. And eventually, as economics change, as there are fewer differences between ICE and electric vehicles based on location, based on the type of vehicles that you're driving, definitely you could move the needle with regards to electrification. But start off with a pilot, include electrification in your fleet. But definitely you can include hybrids as well. I think it's a conservative approach to the response to electrification or sustainability for that matter. But pilots is a little bit more thoughtful, a smart way of approaching electrification.
So you would recommend actually doing a pilot first rather than actually developing a plan for your kind of your entire organization. There's not enough data. There's not enough third-party data out there from other pilots that have been done and published and shared by some of the various sort of advocacy organizations out there.
Yeah, and it could be a combination of the two. I don't think it has to be either or, Nino. Definitely incorporate a pilot, right? You have to be thoughtful about your approach to electrification. If you go back to learning by doing, which we've been speaking about, there's still a lot to learn. The economics itself is, rapidly changing. So that's another aspect of it. So you don't necessarily want to rush towards it. And suddenly, I think there's the constraint of budgeting for a lot of fleets that does not that doesn't lend them the ability to just rush into electrification, right? But definitely you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about it, determine feasibility, estimate the performance of your fleet in order for you to really invest in electrification, if I may. But yeah, it can be both. You have to put a plan together. A lot of our customers are asking for roadmaps. They have certain sustainability goals, and we have to meet those goals. So what does it look like in the next 10 years or 15 years or 30 years for that matter? And so it might be an increasing electric vehicles. So you start off with a very small pilot. And as you understand what the needs are, then you can increase, or, as the dynamics change, you could make those modifications as you move along.
Great, thank you. So you touched on maintenance just in the introduction. I wonder if we could take a little deeper dive on maintenance and repairs. And it'd be interesting to know your experience around, more specifically, kind of what's required from a maintenance point of view, how it compares to combustion, and when EVs get into accidents, what's the cost of repairs like compared to a combustion vehicle? So I just wondered if you could take us through that.
Yeah, when we do look at maintenance, we break it down a little bit because we know that, there are so many different aspects to maintenance that one would have to consider. So, but still, there's a lot of anecdotal data, as we mentioned. We're still in early days for when it comes to electrification, certainly. what we've seen as far as preventive care, there's certain things that you would have to do, right? Which may not be very different from the cadence of ICE vehicles. So checking your brakes, for example. Batteries, you'd have to check on a regular basis because we know that's a significant, component of an electric vehicle. There's certain fluids that you would have to check as well. But the demands as far as preventive care is definitely not comparable to ICE vehicles. It's a lot less. So, of course, the cost of preventive care would be less as well. It's a little too early to tell for repairs. As I mentioned earlier, the utilization would definitely have to increase over time, right? And so I wouldn't rush to any judgments or conclusions around repairs for electric vehicles. Tires, we've seen maybe a slight increase. You would have to definitely replace tires a little bit more frequently than their ICE counterparts because the vehicles are a lot heavier. One of the things that I do caution, however, is there is the need for certification, of course, certified technicians when it comes to electric vehicles. And there has been a shortage of that. So I could see that affecting the price of maintenance. Certainly, demand and supply, it has to be somewhat balanced for us to get to the point where the impact is not seen as much when it comes to maintenance. But I think over time that will somewhat even out. But overall, maintenance is definitely a lot less for electric vehicles today, as far as we're seeing. I do want to caveat that.
Okay, great. I've got a follow-up question to that, but just to invite, we've got some questions in the chat. Just to invite the audience to continue to put their questions in the Q&A. But one of the questions we got from the registration process is, and it's associated with maintenance and repairs, is what specialized training will my fleet maintenance technical staff need to help them migrate from ICE to EV fleets?
When I hear this question, I'm assuming that it is self-managed fleets when they talk about the certifications that they would need. At least, that's how I'm reading that. There are many different vendors across the globe who do have certified technicians already. But there are programs that if you do have a take-home fleet that you don't care to outsource the maintenance needs of electric vehicles, there are certain certifications that can be. I don't think it's very taxing. I think it's a matter of months to get certified, understanding the specific needs of electric vehicles, and certainly there's a need in the market for that. We can definitely send you the information. What I would recommend is reaching out to a professional to understand what those specific certifications are. But it's not a huge demand with regards to time, but I'm sure very much focused on those specific needs for electric vehicles itself.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just before we get on to more audience questions, question on remarketing and what is the again, it all links back to TCO, is what are you finding in terms of the valuations of these vehicles when it comes to the time to take them out of the fleet, how reliably have you been able to benchmark on those remarketing valuations?
Benchmarking, I'm sure you can very well imagine there are not a lot of vehicles out there in the marketplace when it comes to used vehicles, right? We're starting to see some of those vehicles come into the marketplace, but I would not say that they're at a point of critical mass just yet, right? But what we are seeing is that it's not performing as well as ICE vehicles with regards to the retention of its value. And I'll tell you why. There are a few reasons, but I think the most important reason is demand and supply, right? One of the factors that's affecting the demand of used assets is the introduction of newer electric vehicles, right? So we know that increasingly we're seeing more electric vehicles. It's affecting the price is going down, so it's decreasing over time, and that's competing with the used vehicle market. So that's definitely going to reduce the expectations that you would see on the used vehicle market for electric vehicles. And of course, there's still some uncertainty there with regards to the battery health, right? So there are a lot of questions around that. I know that there are a lot of efforts in determining a score for batteries, especially for used vehicles over time. So there are some certifications, that's being worked on to determine what the battery health is. That should give some confidence when one is going to purchase a used electric vehicle. So that certainly will help, but still a lot of uncertainty. What if I were to buy a used electric vehicle and have to replace the battery in short order, right? But anecdotally, what we are seeing is that the health of the battery certainly is being retained by the time it gets to the used vehicle marketplace, right? All we're waiting on is making sure that there's a way to give that particular feedback and show very specifically that it is as healthy as it needs to be in that space.
Hey, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, certainly a lot of downward pressure on pricing, which is affecting the industry and even the OEMs bringing new product to market. One of the audience questions we have is a question on home electricity usage. And hi, Zingha, do you have any advice for how companies can approach measuring home electricity usage and compensating drivers for that cost?
Yeah, that's that's a very frequent question with regards to the reimbursement. I think we currently employ very simple math, right? So how much is the vehicle being driven? What is the cost for your specific location with regards to electricity, and just apply that accordingly. So depending on what the usage is, what the price is, you multiply accordingly. However, we know that it varies by state, by province. There are a lot of variability with regards to energy mixes or whatever it is, whatever those factors are. A lot of our customers just have a flat rate. In some cases, some drivers may pay a little bit more, some pay a little bit less, but usually there's just a flat rate with regards to reimbursement. If you do care to get that specific to that particular driver, we could certainly help you with that. But I'd say just back of the napkin math, what is the typical utilization of electricity? How often do they recharge? How much do they drive? And what's the particular rate in the current region that you operate or charge the vehicle?
Okay, thank you. So another question, audience questions. Do you have any data on fleet electrification that indicates what percentage of fleets are BEVs versus fuel cell electric vehicles?
Yeah, we do. But I'd say, especially particularly for our portfolio, right? What I will say is the majority, and we did a study very recently, which shows very increasingly fleets are interested or somewhat invested in electrification, battery, BVs in particular, right? However, with all of those fears with regards to range, with regards to infrastructure, there's been a little bit of a pullback from jumping in. But I'd say at least 30% of our fleets currently have either pilots or one or few vehicles, or are planning on investing in electric vehicles within the coming year or so, right? Some in conversations with a lot of the fleets that have had some of the reservations is around the economics of things. So they're waiting on that. I think increasingly we're seeing TCO parity for a lot of ICE vehicles versus electric vehicles, particularly when you incorporate incentives. But really and truly, I'd say the majority of our customers do have questions. They do plan on investing in electric vehicles, but some of them are quite slow to take the plunge because of all of those challenges that I just mentioned.
And we have a question on the employee aspect of it. Yep. Would the taxable benefit for personal use of a company EV be a lot higher? Does that result in some employees refusing them?
I'm challenged to see why it would be higher, particularly because, well, it depends. It may be if the vehicles are a lot more expensive, right? The one thing that we do take into consideration when we look at taxable benefits, as far as our recommendation goes, is the full life cycle of the asset, right? So if we're talking about the offset of the fuel cost versus the upfront cost, then maybe it balances itself out a bit. Maybe there are increases with regards to the upfront cost that would lend to an increasing the personal use charge. I'd say it really it depends on the application of the vehicle within the fleet. It depends on the customer's specific application and circumstance. But I don't think it's a necessary increase in personal use, but it could be less. And I think over time, the economics will change. That will lead to decreased personal use charges for sure.
Hey, a question on relating to batteries here. You addressed mechanic certification and maintenance issues. Any thoughts on training for first responders who must deal with EV thermal malfunctions? I don't know if you, I mean, obviously training first responders is out of your scope, but
yes.
I don't know if you've had to deal with that with any actual of your clients who have to manage and maintain the buildings overnight in depots or things like that.
No, I unfortunately haven't. But we do have some customers who are somewhat in this particular space, right? And so there is a need for responsiveness, particularly with regards to emergencies. And I know certainly that making sure that the vehicle is fully operational is definitely top of mind. I don't know if they necessarily think of maintaining the vehicles themselves. I've not gotten that question just yet. Maybe it's yet to come, but I unfortunately do not have an answer to that particular question.
Okay. And final question, Zingha, you've been a great sport and taken loads of questions today, is a question about end of life. And I don't know how many end of life vehicles you've been able to see through. Who owns EV batteries when they reach end of life or when there is a recall or other issue? What is the most common end of life management, i.e. recycling plan? Sorry, what is the most common end of life management plan, i.e. recycling, being discussed by EV fleet stakeholders in regards to batteries? So yeah, I don't know if you have anything there for us.
Yeah, not much. But I can offer an opinion there for sure. Most of our customers, truthfully, don't look at the battery separate from the vehicle, right? So usually when it's remarketed, it definitely goes with the rest of the vehicle. So there's not a separation there. But I think it's a good question to ask about the recycling efforts on batteries for sure. I do know that there's been a lot of investment in the recycling of batteries, particularly because there is an impact on the environment. We know that lithium, for example, is not a renewable resource, right? A lot of the components of a battery they're certainly not renewable. So recycling those materials definitely is important. The process about going about it, I'm not fully aware of what that is. We don't typically get those questions from our customers. They don't necessarily see that side of things. We don't manage that side of things necessarily, but the importance lies in our ability to make this move to electrification a little bit more sustainable, right? A little bit more affordable in the future. And, it's definitely a necessary step when it comes to move to electrification.
Well, Zingha, thank you very much for opening yourself up and bringing all your experience to the table. I think that was quite the tour de force of questions that you went through there, and quite the range of electrification topics that you shared with us. So just on behalf of Electrical Autonomy, on behalf of all the audience, thank you very much for coming and sharing those expertise, and thanks to Element Fleet as well for sponsoring and really partnering us to bring this episode together.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And Zingha, if it's okay with you, there were other questions and there were some people asking for data and resources. So we'll follow up with you to share some of those questions, and we'll aim to follow up with audience members with some of that data that we touched on earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if there's anything that's needed in support of those questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to provide that accordingly.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Zingha. Before we go, there were also questions that we had around how people can actually learn the process of electrification. Like, is there any training courses? And I wanted to share the EV Fleets Pro course that we have. You can see the links shown on the screen here, and I just shared the link in the chat. The EV Fleets Pro course is 30 modules that really take you from the A to EV, as we like to call it, of fleet electrification. And you can go through and take each one of those modules, and at the end you do get an electrical autonomy certificate to confirm that you've completed the course. And that's a really great way to get you and your team understanding some of the issues in a bit more depth around the steps to electrification, so that when you do speak with your vendors and partners, you're up to date and informed. So yeah, we recommend you check out EV Fleets Pro, evfleets.pro, and you can sign up and register for that totally free course. Also, we wanted to let you know about a webinar series we are actually hosting right now. It's a 5-part national discussion series on public EV charging infrastructure. And we have the 3rd episode of that taking place next week, which is on readying the grid for EVs, and not just how we make sure we've got enough power to put in EVs, but also potentially how the grid can take some of the power EVs to help do some grid balancing and actually help with the energy needs overall. So a great lineup of experts for that panel discussion. You can see the links in the chat that my colleagues have shared there, or you can go to the Electrical Autonomy website to register for that. So that's it for today. Thanks again to Zingha and Element Fleet for coming on board, and thanks for all your great questions in the audience, and we look forward to seeing you next week at our next discussions.